Imagine this. You're sitting on the throne in your lavish royal bathroom ready to drop the kids off at school. The porcelain gleams invitingly beneath you. But before you can relieve yourself of your morning dump, you keel over dead from a heart attack. Now imagine that happened to a bunch of kings. Yeah, it's true. A surprising number of monarchs met their end on or near the toilet. So why did the porcelain get so many of them? Henry VIII, King of England from 1509 to 1547, is said to have enjoyed a good poop. He may have been best known for his 6 wives, but he was also a fan of relieving himself with great fanfare. According to chronicler Edward Hall, Henry would issue commands like, "Beware the king comes forth," as he made his way to the privy with a large entourage. There were even special trumpets composed for the occasion. As Henry sat on the throne, a musician would play merry tunes until the king gave a signal for the trumpets to sound. If you've ever tried to go number 2 while someone else is playing an instrument nearby, you know how hard it is to focus on the task at hand. And if you've ever tried to go number 2 while a bunch of people are standing by waiting for you to give them the green light, you know how that just compounds the difficulty. It's safe to say that Henry VIII probably didn't always have an easy time in the bathroom, and we have plenty of record of his bad bowel days. For example, one time he got so backed up that he had to be carried to the privy on a litter. But generally, the king found great joy in the porcelain throne. That is until July 1547, when he was in his usual routine and suddenly collapsed. Some sources say he was in the middle of having a movement when he died, although others say he merely looked weak after he finished. Either way, he died right there in the privy. His royal physician, Dr. Pedro Ortiz, later wrote that the king died from an illness caused by eating too much. Given that Henry ate more than 6 pounds of meat per day, it seems likely that the monarch was a victim of his own prodigious appetite. Although the king's final bowel movement resulting in death might seem like an embarrassing footnote in history, it wasn't seen that way at the time. Henry's chronicler, Edward Hall, wrote that the king's attendants carefully cleaned the privy after the fatal movement so that no one would ever know what had happened there. You might think that getting clogged up and dying on the toilet is a modern problem, but it's been around since at least the Middle Ages. Take, for example, King John Lackland of England, who died in October 1216. He'd been sick for some time and spent his last days at Newark Castle. On his deathbed, he had a very un-king-like request to be taken to the privy. Unfortunately for John, the castle's latrine was located in a room with a low ceiling. According to legend, the king tried to get up to go to the bathroom, but his rear end hit the floor and he couldn't get back up again. Someone helped him back onto his bed, but he quickly asked to go to the privy again. This time he was carried there in a chair, supposedly by 4 barons who were his enemies and who held a grudge against him. They refused to help him back up again, though, and left him stranded on the toilet where he died. Although the story of John being stuck on the toilet has all the makings of a classic tall tale, historians consider it to be a myth. There is no contemporary evidence for it, and the earliest source that mentions it dates from the 19th century. However, we do know that King John died on the toilet, or at least somewhere nearby. In 1215, he experienced stomach pains and bloody diarrhea. His physicians suggested letting nature run its course, which is gross but not terrible advice. We don't want to encourage anyone to listen to unqualified medical advice from YouTube videos, but the prognosis for medieval diarrhea was grim. Even if John had somehow managed to survive the initial bout, the lack of basic hygiene and sanitation meant that he would have been facing secondary infections which could easily kill him. His condition worsened, and his royal secretary wrote that the king suffered pains in his belly, so that day and night he could not rest. As unfortunate as King John's death sounds, things could have been much worse. Just ask Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy from 1467 to 1477. Charles was fond of jousting, hunting, and general merriment, but he took no precautions to protect himself from any potential health consequences of these activities. In fact, he used to say, "A wound received in war is an honor." Well, sometimes. A wound received in war can simply be a wound that gets infected and kills you. And that's what happened to Charles. After suffering an injury in a jousting match in 1467, the Duke developed a fever and bloody diarrhea. By December, he was clearly dying and sent for his physician, who recommended a cathartic, or something that induces bowel movements because the royal patient had been constipated for 2 weeks. The cathartic worked a little too well, and Charles wound up spending his final hours in agony on a water closet. Yes, the humble water closet, or what we today call a toilet with a flushing mechanism, was invented by Sir John Harington in 1596. While it never caught on in England, it did become popular in France and Italy and eventually the world over. Sadly, Charles the Bold was not around to enjoy the widespread adoption of the water closet. When news of Charles's illness reached Pope Paul II, he had a prayer written asking God to convert the infidel heretic back to Catholicism before he died. That prayer was never answered. When Charles's condition worsened, his counselors knew that he would not live through the night, and they began fighting over who would be next in line to rule. Realizing that he was dying, and that his duchy could descend into civil war, Charles reportedly requested that they pause the squabbling so that he could pray. His counselors agreed, and for a moment they forgot about their own interests and focused on the man who was dying on the water closet before them. Let's fast forward from there to the 20th century to see another royal go down on the toilet. On January 20th, 1952, King George VI of Great Britain and Northern Ireland experienced excruciating stomach pains and collapsed onto the toilet. Thankfully for the king, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was there to help him. She called for a doctor, then comforted her husband until help arrived. But the doctor couldn't revive the king. At age 56, George VI had died from a coronary thrombosis, or blood clot in the coronary artery. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, who was staying at Sandringham House at the time, was summoned to Buckingham Palace, where she was told that her father was dead. It should be noted that not every king who died on the toilet did so because of constipation or some other gastrointestinal-related problem. Sometimes it was just bad luck. That's the case with Charles II, who died in 1685 after ruling the United Kingdom for a glorious 49 years. Unlike his Stuart predecessors, Charles did not die on the throne, but he did die at Windsor Castle. He suffered a stroke and collapsed near the privy, but was carried back to his chamber where he was placed in bed. He lived for a few more days, but when it became clear that he would die, his servants were instructed to let him die naturally, whatever that means. Charles II did not die immediately, though. He survived for a whole week without food or drink, during which time his body was covered with linen cloths. Then, when his attendants turned him, they noticed that he had developed bed sores. This was not unusual at the time. If you're lying in bed for an extended period, friction from the bed linens can cause skin to develop into blisters, break open, and become infected. Those infections can kill you, and in Charles's case, they did. Bed sores are still a problem in hospitals today, so we know that they weren't just a product of 17th century medical care. In fact, according to the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, between 15 and 20% of hospital patients develop them. The king was a heavy man, and the bed sores were particularly bad. One of them measured 11 inches wide by 3 inches deep. These wounds were clearly painful, but the king was unconscious and unable to communicate, so there was no way for him to let anyone know how badly he was hurting. After he died on February 6, 1685, his remains were embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. Several weeks later, the coffin was placed inside a stone monument in Windsor Castle. Now you know quite a few kings who kicked the bucket on the toilet. Have any others come to mind? Let us know in the comments. And while you're down there, please consider liking this video. You can also check out these other videos on royal mishaps, including weirdest royal food cravings and worst days in royal history. Thanks for watching.